This meeting is being recorded.
The virtual gavels banged. The Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with remote committee proceedings on HRES 8, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Prior to making my remarks, let me recognize Ranking Member Shabbat, who was not able to join us today due to a family obligation. He's long been a leader on Burma, and I look forward to continuing to work with him on the challenges facing this country as we look for a path forward. I also want to appreciate the Vice Ranking Member, Ms. Wagner, who has long been a champion on issues in Southeast Asia, and particularly Burma, who will be serving in Rep. Shabbat's stead as the ranking member. Thank you, Ms. Wagner, for doing that. Let's talk about why this hearing is so important. When we think about the coup that the Tatmadaw executed almost a year ago on February 1st, we're now marking the first anniversary. The military junta, known as the Tatmadaw, flagrantly disregarded the democratic process that was taking place. It was a young democracy, but the democratic process that the Burmese people had put in place. The Burmese security forces, the Tatmadaw, have detained, jailed, and tortured countless elected representatives, journalists, and human rights defenders in this effort to stifle defense. They've killed thousands of innocent civilians and uprooted and displaced hundreds of thousands more, destabilizing the region. What the Tatmadaw didn't recognize is that the Burmese people have changed. They've experienced some beginnings of freedom, and they rose up, and this feels very different than other uprisings. You've seen several ethnic armed organizations that have used the ongoing crisis to expand their territorial and administrative control of certain regions. And as we've entered the dry season, you've seen the increased fighting that has worsened the already deteriorating humanitarian situation. Having traveled to the region last fall to Thailand to talk to individuals there, to talk to our embassy staff there, as well as NGOs that are operating on the Thai-Burmese border to try to provide aid, there's a real concern that the Tatmadaw will use this dry season extending into May to really try to stifle the resistance movement. That said, we've seen the resistance movement fight back, join together with other ethnic minority groups, and there's a real concern that we're losing a window of opportunity to find a diplomatic solution here to avert this humanitarian crisis. I do want to commend our ASEAN colleagues. I had a chance to visit Jakarta and talk to the Indonesians, who I do want to single out as really taking a leadership role, trying to push ASEAN to find a solution forward. As Indonesia passes as the baton passes on to Cambodia, I really urge my Cambodian colleagues to continue to work within the ASEAN context to push Myanmar to, at a minimum, adhere to the 5-point plan that was put in place. And again, work with countries in the region, including the United States, China, India, and others, to find a path forward here. Today, I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses as they give us an assessment of what they're seeing on the ground, their conversations with the countries in the region, including ASEAN, but also potentially there is an opportunity to find common ground with China where our interests may align, also with the Indians who are, experiencing a border crisis as well as Thailand. I also do want to commend the Biden administration for very early on implementing aggressive sanctions, taking aggressive policy positions, and working with Congress to speak with one voice, Democrats, Republicans, and the administration to condemn this coup. So with that, I really do look forward to our witnesses giving us an update on what's happening on the ground. And let me recognize Representative Ann Wagner. He's the acting ranking member from Missouri. Thank you, Ms. Wagner.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, certainly for holding this very important hearing that is near and dear to my heart. And I'm pleased to be filling in Congressman Shabbat's stead here. And I want to thank our witnesses, certainly for their service. What is happening in Burma is devastating. My heart continues to break for the Rohingya who continue to suffer unimaginable atrocities at the hands of the genocidal Burmese military, our Tatmadaw, and for the courageous protesters braving a brutal crackdown as they fight for democracy. I have been proud to work with my colleagues on this committee to demonstrate Congress's unequivocal support for the Burmese people seeking a return to democracy, as well as our strong condemnation of the military coup. I'm happy to say that the Foreign Affairs Committee unanimously advanced HRES 896 just last week, which condemns the Burmese military for perpetrating gross violations of human rights. And I am hopeful that this legislation will soon be considered by the House. I am also urging the House to immediately take up Chairman Meek's HR 5497, which is the Burma Act, of which I am a proud co-sponsor. This critical legislation imposes tough sanctions on the perpetrators of the coup, requires action to cut off the regime's sources of financial support, and calls on the State Department to formally designate the persecution of Rohingya as, in fact, genocide. The United States must continue to support the people of Burma as they stand up to the military junta and to bring to justice those responsible for egregious human rights violations and crimes against humanity. The global norms that safeguard international peace and security require active defense and enforcement by the international community. And in the last few years, we have seen China, Russia, Iran, and other autocracies align against democratic norms, universal human rights, and even rights to freedom and self-determination. Our adversaries are watching to see how we will respond when peace and democratic freedoms are challenged. The Biden administration's failure to respond swiftly and decisively to Russian aggression against Ukraine using a deterrent factor before a Russian invasion and uphold the responsibilities to our Afghan allies has further emboldened some of the dictators and bullies around the world. It is difficult to believe that any responsible member of the international community would hesitate to take action against Burma's military junta, which has committed genocide against the Rohingya Muslims, illegally seized control of the Burmese government, and visited extraordinary violence and suffering on its own people. And yet, China and Russia continue to stand in the way of efforts to build a coordinated and meaningful international response to the crisis in Burma. This is unacceptable, and I urge the administration to demand stronger action in the United Nations, to hold the Tatmadaw accountable. We must do more to isolate and punish the Burmese military, and it is imperative that the United States show strong and consistent leadership through this crisis to secure a future in which rule of law and democracy underpin relations among states. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Representative Wagner. Let me now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Kim Moy. Mr. Moy was appointed Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs on June 15, 2021. Immediately prior to this appointment, Mr. Moy was the Acting Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He has been a Foreign Service officer for 29 years. Mr. Moy, thank you for your service. Our second witness is USAID Deputy Assistant Administrator Craig Hart. Craig Hart is a career member of the USAID Senior Foreign Service and has served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for East Asia and the Pacific since August 2020. Prior to this, Craig served as Deputy Mission Director in Vietnam from 2016 to 2020. Since joining USAID in 2005, he has served as a program officer in Tanzania, Afghanistan, the Republic of Georgia, and Washington, D.C. Mr. Hart, thank you for your service. Let me go ahead and recognize Mr. Moy for 5 minutes of his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Vice Ranking Member, and all of the subcommittee members here today. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you about this very grave situation in Burma. The opening remarks that you made, Mr. Chairman, and as well as you, Madam Vice Ranking Member, were very thoughtful, very insightful. I think Secretary Blinken would want me to say that we will continue to work with you. We will continue to share as much information about the situation there as we can in order to really unite, in order to, protect as many Burmese citizens as we possibly can. In the year following the coup, the total damage the Burmese military has inflicted on innocent people in the country is impossible to calculate. But I'd like to share a few data points with you to demonstrate the devastation it has wrought. Credible sources indicate the military has killed more than 1,500 people in Burma, including at least 117 children, and those are only the deaths that have been verified. The number is likely much larger. The regime has arrested at least 12,000 people, and more than 9,000 of them remain in detention. More than 400,000 have been forced to flee their homes and are internally displaced, while others are seeking refuge in neighboring countries. The numbers paint a bleak picture, and the Burmese military's determination to employ horrific violence shows no sign of letting up. This is the same force that committed ethnic cleansing and other atrocities against Rohingya in 2017. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to spend a few minutes detailing how the administration is grappling with this situation, including our efforts to pressure the regime to immediately cease the violence, allow unhindered humanitarian access, release those unjustly detained by the military, including wrongfully detained U.S. citizen Ja Tae-woo, ensure those responsible for atrocities and other human rights abuses are held to account, and swiftly return Burma toward a path to inclusive democracy. Immediately after the military detained Burma's elected leaders, the State Department acted quickly to assess that the military carried out a coup d'etat. President Biden issued an executive order shortly thereafter. The executive order authorizes sanctions in connection with the coup, including on individuals and entities responsible for undermining democratic institutions in Burma and on their family members. We have used this authority to apply targeted sanctions on 65 individuals and sanctioned or placed export controls on 26 entities to date. These include top military commanders, senior officials of the regime and their family members, as well as entities that generate revenue for the military and its leaders, and cronies that are involved in the military's procurement of weapons. The State Department continues to work with the Department of Treasury and other interagency partners to identify and assess additional sanctions, as well as other actions to restrict revenue to the regime. A top consideration when carrying out targeted sanctions is to ensure we are not exacerbating the humanitarian crisis on the ground or increasing poverty for the people of Burma. We have closely coordinated all of our actions, including sanctions, with our allies and partners to present a united front in the international community. We regularly consult with our partners in capitals across the world, and the United States remains a leading voice in driving international policy on Burma. This coordination has severely limited the regime's international space. The UN General Assembly has also called on states to prevent the flow of arms into Burma, and our colleagues at the U.S. mission to the UN similarly pushed for action there. The UN is established and the administration is supporting the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, otherwise known as IIMM, to lay a robust foundation for criminal accountability efforts that may become available. Since the coup, the UN Security Council has met 7 times to discuss the situation in Burma. Outside of the United Nations, senior State Department officials are in regular contact with their ASEAN counterparts, and we value the role of ASEAN centrality, as well as efforts by individual member states in promoting a peaceful resolution to the crisis and providing much needed support to the people of Burma. We are also in regular contact with the National Unity Government and other representatives from the pro-democracy movement. Burma faces both a political crisis and a humanitarian crisis on top of a myriad of economic and other challenges. And I will defer to my good friend, USAID Deputy Assistant Administrator Craig Hart, on those details of our efforts to mitigate the humanitarian crisis. But I'd like to highlight the ongoing work to support vulnerable populations with Congress's support. In fiscal year 2021, the U.S. government provided more than $434 million in humanitarian assistance for those affected by ongoing violence, including those internally displaced in Burma, refugees from Burma in the region, and communities hosting refugees from Burma. Again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for your time and all of the members of the subcommittee, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Moy. And I should have said, without objection, both witnesses' prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Now let me go ahead and recognize Mr. Hart for his opening statement of 5 minutes.
Chairman Barra, Vice Ranking Member Wagner, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today regarding the important role that the United States Agency for International Development is playing to address the ongoing crisis in Burma. It was just 1 year ago that the start of the military coup d'etat slammed the door shut on Burma's recent democratic opening. The coup is worsening the humanitarian plight of the people of Burma and has rolled back years of development gains, threatening what prosperity and freedom the country had achieved. So in 2021, poverty doubled, the country's GDP plummeted by 18%. Government services are crippled, including health. The coup and pandemic have stolen more than a year and a half of education from over 12 million children. TB treatment and case notifications plunged by half, elevating the risk of multi-drug resistant variants that could spread beyond Burma's borders. Some 6 million people in Burma are now requiring humanitarian assistance. So on the ground, USAID partners face harassment, detention, raids, intimidation, and deadly violence. Despite these challenges, our USAID office that was reopened almost 10 years ago in Burma and our great implementing partners are continuing to support health, livelihoods, and education, and the drive for peace, democracy, and human rights. USAID's comparative advantage is our field presence and our programmatic flexibility. Just days after the start of the coup, we shifted more than $42 million in assistance from activities that would have benefited the government to expand work supporting local civil society, NGOs, and private sector partners to benefit the people of Burma, not the regime. Our immediate concern has been delivering humanitarian assistance. In 2021, we reached over 430,000 people with life-saving aid through internal access. USAID's partners, including the UN World Food Program, continue to deliver food and other critical assistance to hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons. For Rohingya IDPs and other vulnerable people in the Rakhine State, USAID provides shelter, water, and COVID-19 prevention, among other services. In health, USAID has expanded health service delivery through NGOs, ethnic health organizations, and the private sector. Burma is currently has the lowest proportion of people who are fully vaccinated against COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. The regime secured about 60 million doses from the People's Republic of China, India, and Russia as of February 13th, and has administered 2 doses to about 36% of the population. The COVID-19 vaccine facility, COVAX, allocated but has yet to deliver about 10.7 million doses to Burma, since this is pending agreement regarding vaccine distribution. USAID and like-minded donors agree that COVAX can play a unique role in vaccinating people who cannot or will not seek vaccinations through a regime-controlled rollout. USAID supports site readiness for COVID-19 in terms of the vaccine doses that are coming, and also promotes COVID-19 prevention, testing, and treatment in community clinics. Since the coup began, we have launched 4 new activities. The first of these supports human rights defenders and pro-democracy groups, equipping civil society with the tools that they actually need to respond to human rights violations and atrocities. This is strengthening the foundations of resilience that the people will rely on to achieve their democratic aspirations. The second will strengthen the quality of basic education through non-government, ethnic, and monastic providers, helping them meet community needs, and this includes out-of-school youth as well. Finally, 2 health activities will ensure that people in conflict-affected and hard-to-reach areas can still access malaria, HIV, and TB services that benefit the people of Burma and help prevent global threats. USAID will continue to look for new opportunities to support the people of Burma as we work to regain what has been lost in the face of this derailed democratic trajectory. Thank you for the opportunity to represent USAID, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each. All time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. To both witnesses, thank you for your testimony. A few weeks ago, Chairman Meeks, myself, Ranking Member Shabbat, had a chance to virtually have a conversation with our ambassador to Burma, Tom Vida. And I should recognize and thank the folks in our mission that still operates in Rangoon for their service, obviously operating in a difficult circumstance. He did give us an assessment of what we were seeing on the ground, and maybe Pete Asmoy, I'd direct that first question to you. This feels very different right now. That the Tatmadaw has made statements that they've been sanctioned before, that they can survive the sanctions and continue to operate, and that may necessarily be true, but what seems different this time is the rising up of the Burma people, and the resiliency of this resistance move. The Burma people are coming together with some of the ethnic minorities, whether it's under the national unity government. And my big fear is that this may be a long, protracted conflict that may spill into an all-out civil war, and the diplomatic opportunity to find a solution may be closing fairly rapidly. And while it's not synonymous with what we saw in the Middle East and Syria, I mean, there are some similarities that you may have a full-on failed state that does put tremendous pressure on the region and the other countries in the region. I guess the question Pete Asmoy is the window to find a diplomatic solution closing? Is there a diplomatic solution that doesn't include bring the Tatmadaw to the table in some way to de-escalate violence? And then what are the opportunities? I touched on in my opening statement the importance of ASEAN here, and again, I think the Indonesians and others have done a wonderful job trying to push ASEAN to lead a solution. But are there, India clearly has some concerns here. China clearly has some concerns, and is there a place where our interests may align? So I'll recognize Pete Asmoy first.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. First, let me thank you for recognizing Ambassador Vida, who's done incredible work out in the field, and his mission out there, who continue to work in some very unfavorable conditions to say the least. You raise a very good point about the difference between 2022 and the 1990s. I think a year ago, you would hear many sort of grizzled veterans of the region say, well, we can expect the junta will consolidate power and prevail as it has in the past. Well, that didn't happen, as you noted. And one of the reasons for that, and I think that all of us agree, that over the last few years, because of the influence of democratic governance, the people of Burma, especially those younger generations, continue to thirst for governance that represents the people's interest and the rule of law. And so the situation is much different today, where if you ask people on the ground, people in the region, they would say, well, they had thought that the junta would have consolidated power by now. But in fact, that's not the case at all. If you're on the ground, and Ambassador Vida has noted this to us, they are not in control. And one of the reasons is there is so much opposition, especially among those who continue to thirst for that democracy. I do agree with you completely that we still, even though we have tapped into multilateral groups and we have talked to like-minded countries, we can still urge more coordination in terms of showing the junta that they are not likely to prevail in the near future, and their options are limited. And we are hopeful that that creates an environment that is conducive for all parties, especially those who are promoting nonviolence and a return to democracy, an environment where they can get together. Ambassador Vida has said this often to us, and I think it is absolutely true, and that is the change in Burma must come within. And I'm hopeful, and we are all hopeful, that with US support and other countries, like-minded countries, and also you mentioned partners like India, and also maybe also reaching out. I know that Secretary Blinken has spoken to China about Burma issues as well, but other parties, especially those on the border, can play a role in encouraging a kind of dialogue and maybe disabusing the notion that this is going to be the junta of the 1990s prevailing once again. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And since we're a smaller group today, we'll probably do a second round of questions because I have a number of other questions. But let me go and recognize Representative Ann Wagner from Missouri.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Russia has undermined the international response to the coup by selling the junta more than $2.3 billion in weapons over the last year, while it prepares the most significant threat to peace in Europe since World War II. Deputy Assistant Secretary Moy, what consequences will the United States impose on Russia for being complicit in the Tatmada's staggering human rights abuses?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Congresswoman. Well, we continue to press the regime to cease the violence, release all of those who are unjustly detained, and return Burma to a path to democracy. As you have noted, with regard to international arms sales and flows into Burma, I'm not going to personally name and shame myself, but I think we all know what you were talking about because you cited the name of the country. We led efforts last June at the UN General Assembly to call on the suspension of arms flows into Burma. And the secretary himself has pledged to seek ways to cut off the regime's access to weapons. Just earlier this month, we co-signed with 35 other countries a statement commemorating the one-year anniversary of the coup, and there was a prominent mention of a call for an arms embargo and the end to transfers to the regime. I think we all know that arms trafficking is one of the kind of shadowy or even shady types of transactions we see out there. There are times when our government learns about potential arms flows or different packages that could go into Burma. And when we learn of this information, we can work bilaterally to try to dissuade countries.
Well, I appreciate that. $2.3 billion in weapons over the last year alone from Russia is unconscionable. I'm certainly proud. Let me just say that Congress has never hesitated to call the violence against the Rohingya what it is, in fact, which is genocide. But the United States has now at last recognized the Uyghur and the Armenian genocides, but has not yet recognized the Rohingya genocide. And Deputy Assistant Secretary Moy, why has the administration neglected to make a formal determination on the Rohingya genocide?
Thank you very much for the question. As you know, the Secretary did commit to a review last year of the atrocities committed against Rohingya, and the review would make a determination whether it fit the criteria for genocide determination. The review is ongoing. I don't have a timetable for you in terms of when that will conclude, but what makes this determination so impactful is that we review factual information. We review all the evidence. We review, the interviews of people, and then we make an objective determination. And so I think at the end of this process, we will give a recommendation to the Secretary. Again, this is ongoing, but we are going to be meticulous in how we approach that review.
Well, let me just jump in because I have so many other questions, but I have to say, I hope that you will take into account Congress's lead in calling this, in fact, what it is, genocide, because it's been very bipartisan. And I also, let me just say, I'm outraged that China and Russia are impeding efforts to craft a robust response to the coup in the United Nations. Deputy Assistant Secretary Moy, how is the United States working to break this deadlock over an international arms embargo on the Burmese military?
Well, as I noted, we led an effort last June at the General Assembly in New York to call out countries and to call on an arms embargo. I think that with regard to Russia in particular, because we see them, or we see that country as being the sort of the main perpetrator in this case. There are other countries as well, but I think that to find ways to apply pressure, international pressure, using our like-minded countries, where we come together and we call on all countries to refrain from arms flowing in. I think that when arms do flow into Burma, it necessarily means that there will be more destabilization there. There will be more violence. And I hardly think, especially with border countries, that's in the interest of Burma's neighbors. And so we are going to rely on like-mindeds to also help persuade or dissuade Russia from those kinds of transactions.
The time is urgent. My time has run out. I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Wagner. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Hulan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hart and Mr. Moy, for joining us today. Last May, this committee held a hearing on, at the time, the recent coup in Burma and how the United States was responding. And I asked at that time about the potential positive impact that American businesses could have if they stayed in Burma by continuing to provide jobs and economic support to local communities. So as a follow-up to that question, I was wondering if you could tell me if the State Department or USAID is indeed tracking American commercial involvement in Burma still, and if a significant number of companies chose to leave or to stay, and for those possibly that stayed, has their presence in fact supported the Burmese people? And either one of you, please. Thank you.
I don't know if Craig, you wanted to start. I can maybe
Sure.
address. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And I would say that one of the areas that we have very much focused in on has been the humanitarian assistance and food security. And so what we have been doing as part of that food security spectrum is both bringing in significant amounts of humanitarian assistance through our partners, but also looking at local options for supporting the smallholder farmers for processing locally to ensure that there's another option to food security. And so that's one of the areas where we have worked with the private sector to be able to engage on that. I don't currently have a breakout of U.S. companies within that mix, but that is very much an area that we're zeroing in on. The other area that we've worked with private sector is the health provision, looking at private health clinics, because many people are not comfortable or cannot access public clinics. So therefore, we have shifted our entire program to look at working with other partners, be they local NGOs, international, and others who are operating in that space as well, because the health gains that we had achieved are really have significantly backslid in areas like TB and other maternal and child and health areas as well. And so we're looking for a range of partners, very much to include private sector, to help address those gaps. Thank you.
In terms of American businesses and other businesses, for that matter, who are working in Burma, we regularly consult with them. As you may have seen on the 1-year anniversary of the coup, we actually issued a business advisory to frankly, or to have a frank discussion about the potential hazards of working in Burma. We do support businesses that are legitimately working there because our commitment is to helping the people of Burma. We think that having economic activity there, especially when there are trusted U.S. firms or trusted foreign firms, that can help the population there. But it is tricky. We want to make sure that we are not legitimizing the junta. We are not legitimizing what we regard as an illegitimate force that took over a year ago. And so to make sure that those sources of revenue do not flow to those who are perpetrating violence, that is a commitment of ours as well.
Sure. And I totally understand from both of you gentlemen, the dangers that exist if the resources that we're sending end up having unintended consequences. But I do think it's intriguing and interesting that, as near as I can tell, neither of you know of what businesses remain that are American, run or operated, or maybe have we not documented whether they've stayed. Do we have a very directed and specific outreach to them that you clearly these, or not clearly, I would assume these would be trusted assets and resources because they're American owned and operated. So it's intriguing to me that we don't have a direct program or plan or understanding of where they are. Is that a fair statement?
We do keep contact through our embassy. I don't know, I'm not aware of any comprehensive list of U.S. firms that are working there. However, we are in touch with American citizens who do business there. And there is a Chamber of Commerce as well that we maintain contact with. Again, we would advocate on behalf of U.S. firms that are trying to do legitimate business there. It is in our national interest to help the Burmese people and to make sure. I think earlier there was a mention, and we hate to use this terminology because it sounds so ominous, but we don't want Burma to be a failed state. Yeah. And if its economy doesn't exist and if it continues to plummet further, that's exactly what we might have.
No, I appreciate that. And with waning seconds, I know I've run out of time. I want to, foot stomp on the fact that we should be benefiting from the private sector, as you guys have mentioned, and particularly those who are American-owned businesses and operated in the area would seem to be trusted resources. And I think we should have a better handle on who they are and how we can be using them. And with that, I yield back. And thank you for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you, Representative Houlihan. And with that, let me go ahead and recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, a friend, gentleman from California. Mr. Moy, I think I'll start with you, if you don't mind. Secretary Blinken, when he was confirmed, I think made a commitment to make a determination on the Rohingya genocide. And I'm sure you know, and certainly my colleague, Ms. Wagner, has brought this up. I think it's kind of all on our minds. I think in 2018, if memory serves correctly, about 400. So that's a fairly large chunk of Congress. It's hard to get 40 on agreement on something, let alone 400 agreed to characterize it as such. I'm just wondering if you know and can impart to us what else it will take, or is there something that the secretary's waiting on? There's something he needs to see. What are we waiting on regarding the determination of genocide?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Congressman. And as I noted earlier, the review is ongoing. I think that it's just, I think the secretary is waiting for the conclusion of that. And so I don't think that there's any sort of special delay or reason for delay here. It's just this is a fairly meticulous process that has to go through, legal review as well as other. But that doesn't really stop us at all from continuing to condemn those who perpetrated these atrocities. And we have taken steps in recent years, including through Global Magnitsky, to identify some of those key figures involved in the atrocities, and it doesn't stop us from applying sanctions on those individuals.
And listen, I appreciate that. I don't know. I suspect there's no timeline associated with it. And look, as a guy who lived in the private sector, many of us have, it's frustrating, that we can't get this done. I know there's a process, but for goodness sakes, I mean, you can imagine how much that would help us, would help the world community in dealing with what's happened in Burma. And quite honestly, for the people that continue to suffer there, my goodness, I mean, I don't know if you just wait until there's nothing left to do to say that, we recognize what happened in the past. I mean, we want to help people now. We can't change the past, but for goodness sakes, let's speed it up. I would just say that from my standpoint, if you're going to send a message back to the secretary, light a fire under somebody's rear end. People are being persecuted, they're being tortured, they're tormented and killed. It's unacceptable, quite honestly. It's just taking too long. I'll just move on here. Can you, or how do you assess China's approach to Burma, and what do you believe their most important goals are, and what they might do in the upcoming months to pursue those goals? So where's China? What's their position on Burma? What are they going to do?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one because as a border country with a long history, actually, especially the relationship between the sort of familial relationships across the border, China has a very unique way of approaching Burma. What we would request, as we do with other neighboring countries, is that they all play a constructive role in achieving peace. I think that China, because of their concerns about instability across their border, it doesn't matter if it's Burma or any other country, it could be North Korea, it could be other countries that I think there are 17 countries that sit on China's borders, but I think that's always their central concern. And so, we
what
have.
What are they willing to do about it?
Well, without going into too much detail, it's my understanding that they have reached out to some of the ethnic groups across the border. I think that they're trying to, in their own ways, tamp down the level of violence right now because it doesn't serve their interests. And that's really where China usually comes from. It's not necessarily an altruistic goal, but it's something that serves their own national interests. And I think that keeping that border calm, whether it has
is
to
the U.S. Excuse me, is the U.S. government or any of our NGOs working directly with China to facilitate our goals in Burma?
I'm not aware that we work together on issues like humanitarian assistance. I think, as I understand, they have had their own ways of getting vaccines to Burma. But we have, Secretary Blinken, in fact, has raised with his counterpart the Burma issue and our kind of shared interest in making sure that the violence stops. And I think that there are other countries that share those goals as well, including India.
Okay.
Like
Thank you. My time is long expired. I appreciate the chair's diligence and patience. Thank you very much. I yield.
Thank you, Representative Perry. I see Mr. Sherman's camera on, but I don't see Mr. Sherman. So not seeing the gentleman from California, let me go ahead and recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Representative Levin, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Chair Bera, and thanks for having this really important hearing. And I want to thank you, Deputy Assistant Administrator Hart and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Moy, for appearing before us. You know, this hearing today speaks not just to the immediate and ongoing crisis in Burma, but also to larger questions about our government's duty to the international community in the face of genocide, and our willingness to adhere to the democratic values to which we aspire. During my first trip as a member of Congress, I visited the Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, where over 700,000 people fled after a horrific campaign of violence against them. Long since that trip now, I remain shocked and saddened that our government has not acknowledged what we already know to be true. Military forces in Burma committed atrocities that amount to genocide against the Rohingya people. In fact, I shudder to think that it is in part because of our government's refusal to recognize this fact that the Tatmadaw continue to act with impunity and their brazenness grows by the day. Pete S. Moy, I was glad to read in your testimony that the State Department is working to ensure those responsible for atrocities and other human rights abuses are being held to account, to quote you. And I've heard some of the earlier back and forth on this. But, you know, in 2018, the State Department found that violence committed by the Burmese military against the Rohingya, including from August to October 2017, was not only, and I'm quoting, extreme, large scale, widespread, and seemingly geared toward both terrorizing the population and driving out the Rohingya residents, end quote, but also, quote, well-planned and coordinated. Given this, and reports by groups like the U.S. Holocaust Museum and Fortify Rights that painstakingly, sir, detail the systematic violence and crimes committed by the Tatmadaw, by Burmese militants working with them and others, the question of why the State Department is slow walking this determination just has to be answered. On the anniversary of the coup this year, the Jewish Rohingya Justice Network issued a statement calling out the United States and the international community's failure to help the people of Burma. As they put it, remaining silent is not an option, particularly when it is the very same military that led the genocide against the Rohingya that is now in control and continuing to commit atrocities against the Burmese people. So, Pete S. Moy, I understand that you're not answering this question directly today, but I really need you to commit to me to a timeline to get back to me or to explain why the State Department is taking so much time to something, with all due respect to your earlier statements about how painstaking you're being and so forth. This is extremely well documented, sir. So give me an answer.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. I wouldn't agree with the characterization that we're slow walking this at all. In fact, I know that this
it's 5 years, sir. It's 5 years.
The review started. I mean, the secretary committed last year to the review, and we are undertaking that review. You know, we're still in the process of finalizing, and we're just going to be very meticulous. It's we take this very, very seriously, and I can commit to you that we will continue to share information about this with you and your team about how we are proceeding. And we know that people are watching. We get inquiries from human rights organizations and other interested parties all the time. And
all right.
so
Well, let me go on. I appreciate your willingness to be in touch with my office directly. And Mr. Chair, if without objection, if it's all right, I would like to enter the full statement from the Jewish Rohingya Justice Network into the record.
Without objection.
All right. So, Pete S. Moy, I want to turn very quickly to another way the Biden administration can hold the Tatmadaw accountable. I'm the co-lead of the new resolution with the chair and ranking member of this subcommittee, Chair Meeks, Congresswoman Eshoo, which both recognizes the sanctions the Biden administration has imposed thus far and calls for you to go further, including by sanctioning Tatmadaw-controlled entities and state-owned enterprises. Does the State Department agree that continuing to allow entities like the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise to operate freely enables the Tatmadaw to continue to act with impunity and gives them resources for their oppression?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. It's one that we've been discussing over the last year. I can say that there is no tool out there that we have rejected, no tool out there that might have an impact on the calculation of the junta that we've dismissed. And so without going into specifics and revealing our hand, I would say that we continue that discussion. We also, and I think that Mr. Chairman, I know that you have traveled in the region fairly recently, as you probably heard. When we apply these broader kinds of actions, we always have to consider some of the effects, especially on the people of Burma. And so those are the kinds of things that we consider. The bigger the impact, we do understand that there are some actions that we could take that might have a very, very deep impact on the thinking of the junta. But we always have to remember that they do have impacts on ordinary citizens as well. And that's something that we really do have to, take into consideration. And
Well, thank
also
you.
in consideration other countries. Thank
Well,
you.
thanks. I think you may know that I'm the author of other legislation to, deal with the impact of sanctions on civilians. And so I'm very sensitive to that. Mr. Chairman, I just want to close by thanking the State Department, and in particular, you all have mentioned Ambassador Vida. This team, Mr. Chairman, and Ambassador Vida and his team in Myanmar worked tirelessly to win the release of my constituent, Danny Fenster, who was unjustly imprisoned for 5.5 months. And I will always be grateful to the embassy and consular officials in Burma and the whole State Department team for their assistance in getting Danny Fenster out of that unjust detention. And with that, I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you, Representative Levin. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I realize that we skipped Representative Sherman. If we need to go back to him, we can do that if you need to. I'm cool with it.
I don't see him, so go ahead and continue.
Do what?
Do you see him? Do you,
Mr. Chairman, is it my turn or is it the gentleman's turn?
although we're alternating Democrat and Republican, so Mr. Burchett, if you want to go, and then Mr. Sherman, you're up next.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, this is for Mr. Moy and Mr. Hart. I understand that the Burmese military, they don't even recognize the Rohingya people. And I'm wondering what USAID's doing to help these folks specifically. But then, Mr. Moy, you mentioned that I think I'm curious about the humanitarian aid that we are sending, and they're ripping us off and they're stealing it. And I'm wondering what we're doing to stop that, and how much of it is actually getting to the people we intend it to go to. That's for both of y'all.
Great. Maybe I can start if that's okay. So thank you very much for the question. That's an extremely important area for us, of course. And the U.S. government is leading the donor and humanitarian response to the conflict. And we have about 1.6 billion since August of 2017, of which USAID is about 711 of that, in terms of responding both to the conflict within Burma and to the refugees from Burma. So that's the large picture aspect of things. For FY21, for example, USAID provided almost $50 million in critical humanitarian needs of IDPs in Burma for about 430,000 people. What that really means in terms of items on the ground is that what we're doing is we're procuring locally and regionally to be able to provide protection services, nutrition, mobile medical clinics, shelter and settlements there. Also essential household items, sanitation kits, drinking water, et cetera. So the basics. This picture is shifting inside of Burma week by week and sometimes day by day. And our partners are doing a few things to adapt because adaptation is critical. So one, we're working with World Food Program and others to expand our local NGO base to be able to push these items out to Burma in a variety of ways to ensure that we're actually addressing the most needy of individuals through our systems. The great thing is that we have, and since it's been almost 10 years since we have reopened our USAID office in Burma, and therefore have built a platform by which we can continue to operate. We have a lot of the relationships in place. And so with the humanitarian assistance, we're operating from those relationships. We're also very much closely working with the UN and others, such as the ASEAN Center for Humanitarian Assistance there as well, where we've been assisting them in the past and continue to collaborate with them to look for new opportunities and new ways to be able to ensure that these items reach the intended beneficiaries. That's one. You also mentioned in terms of the aspect of are these materials actually getting to the intended recipients? One, we immediately after the coup, we shifted out $42 million worth of our portfolio away from assistance that could have benefited the government. So we took that immediate action. We took that assistance and made sure that that was supporting the civil society actors and others in a very direct fashion. But since then, we've also launched additional programs for education as well as human rights and civil society. And so we're taking those actions to immediately stand up our response to support exactly these groups. If there is at any time, while we do not provide any assistance, of course, to the regime, if there is any type of report, we have reporting mechanisms from our partners in terms of standard practice, but we also have a public hotline to be able to have folks call in and identify issues that they see. And so we are taking every precaution to ensure that there is no overlap there, that these items are not hitting anyone within the regime, or that the regime is allowed to even take credit for any of those. And so I think those are some of the critical pieces that you referred to, sir.
I think Mr. Hart actually went into some of the areas I was going into, but our main principles are really to make sure that we don't legitimize the junta and that we close off all forms of revenue. And so I think that we do have some the system in place to ensure that doesn't happen. Specifically in terms of Rakhine State, USAID and the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, what we know as PRM, and with the generous support of Congress, actually, has provided more than $201 million in humanitarian assistance to those affected by the Rakhine State crisis within Burma, and that's since 2017. So I think in total, Mr. Hart mentioned this before, but we provided more than $1.2 billion to assist those affected by the crisis in Burma, and Bangladesh as well, and where about 900,000 Rohingya are right now. But we work, as Craig said, to make sure that none of those monies go to the illegitimate junta.
All right, I think I'm about out of time, but I just wanted to warn you all, the tides are kind of shifting in Washington. In the past, I've supported USAID, but I would hope we could get some definite answers over if this aid is actually getting to where it's supposed to be. And I had some others about the Russians and their involvement, the Chinese, but I believe my time is up, Mr. Chairman. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Burgess.
All right. Thank you, brother. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. I want to build on other comments, particularly those of Mr. Levin regarding the Rohingya. We have seen a democracy movement in Burma, Myanmar, that has inspired us. Many of us have come to know Aung San Suu Kyi as an inspirational figure, and we're so disappointed when the democracy movement in Burma was unwilling to state clearly that all the Rohingya born in Burma should be given citizenship documents and repatriated. Has Aung San Suu Kyi herself embraced that explicitly?
Thank you, Congressman. Not that we're aware of, but we have focused our attention on the atrocities themselves, and that is why we have called out the junta. The Burmese military is responsible.
We're being called upon. Look, we know how bad the junta is, but we're being called upon to support a democracy movement that seems to believe in democracy for almost all the people of Burma, and can't bring itself to oppose the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. They make a few statements like, well, we should respect the Rohingya according to Burmese law. Then you look at Burmese law and it says wipe out the Rohingya, or at least don't give them citizenship documents, make them all illegal residents, and then presumably expel them. So our friends should listen to us more than we expect our enemies to listen to us. Has a democracy movement said that the Rohingya people who were born in Burma are Burmese citizens and entitled to citizenship documents?
Not that I'm aware of, sir. If
that is consistent with what I know, and is very disappointing. And I would point out that if neither the junta nor even the democracy movement, if Burma is unwilling to govern its territory in a way that is non-genocidal to the people who have a right to live there, then maybe a portion of Rakhine State should become independent or join Bangladesh. We have only recognized this century, I believe, one change international border, that being the creation of South Sudan. And we did so precisely because the government in Khartoum was intent upon oppression, some would say genocide, of a portion of its territory, and it lost that territory. I'm also concerned with the fact that we're still giving economic aid to Burma. I brought this up in the hearing that we did on September 28th of last year. We've got a way, money we send, economic development aid we send to Burma, to aid that we could provide to starving people in Yemen or Tigray. And I understand why we would provide food aid to displaced people, but we're also providing economic development aid. That was defended by your colleague, Mr. Scheer, on the theory that we need to keep the Burmese people on our side. Should we be helping the junta meet its economic development objectives in Burma, Myanmar?
Thank you, Congressman. With regard to the Rohingya issue, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the various groups, especially the pro-democracy groups. But in our recent meetings, in fact, with the NUG, they have invited in Rohingya to represent a part of their larger group. And so that was the first time.
That's a step in the right direction, and clearly the democracy groups are less bent on ethnic cleansing and genocide than the junta is. But that's the low bar. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. But yes, there are small steps, and I think there's recognition, especially after having more and more consultations with international partners and countries that are interested in democracy, like the United States. I think we talked about economic issues a little bit earlier. We are very concerned when the junta can benefit from any economic arrangements, and so when we consult with companies, that is one thing that we caution, and we're very much opposed. But we are very much in favor of legitimate businesses that can help the Burmese people.
Yeah, my question was about American tax dollars going to economic development in Burma, and that ought to be redirected to less ambiguous situations where it's clearly beneficial to the goals that we all have. And with that, I yield back.
Great. Thank you, Representative Sherman. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Kim, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bera and Acting Member Ann Wagner. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. You know, Congress stands united in continuing to condemn the violent coup in Myanmar last year. And that resulted in the murdering of unarmed civilians, destruction of the democratically elected government, and continued persecution of ethnic minorities. However, the United States and allied Western pressure on Myanmar can only accomplish so much when the country is no stranger to isolation and relying on China and its Southeast Asian neighbors. The first question is to you, Secretary Moy. Could you please assess ASEAN's efforts to lessen the violence in Myanmar and urge a return to dialogue? And how has the United States supported ASEAN diplomacy on Myanmar or urged a more forceful response from its Southeast Asian neighbors?
Thank you for the question, Madam Congresswoman. It is a very good question because since the very beginning last year, in the days following the coup, ASEAN has had to respond to a very uncomfortable situation for them because so many of the ASEAN members do not support what happened there. I think that you saw in the last few months, even though the 5-point consensus has not been adopted yet, ASEAN has sought to marginalize the junta by not allowing political representation from Myanmar, from Burma, in ASEAN leadership meetings. And so just today, I was reading an account of the ongoing ASEAN foreign ministers meeting in Cambodia, and they have not allowed Burma to send political representation there. So they are at odds. And so we really do tip our cap to them because this is quite unprecedented for ASEAN. As you may know, it is a consensus organization, and they sometimes may be willing to try to appease, or they're unwilling to take a harder position. But we think that in ASEAN today, there is recognition that this is the coup cannot be supported, cannot be legitimized by ASEAN, and they're choosing ways to make that known. And I think it was, from what I understand, it was very unexpected from the perspective of the junta. They did not believe that ASEAN would take this step, and they have. And so I think that we will continue to rely on ASEAN centrality, but also use other kinds of diplomacy, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, other like-mindeds to make the junta aware that 2022 is certainly not the 1990s.
Thank you so much. I would also like to ask how you would describe the opposition to the military junta government, including the National Unity Government, specifically in organization, goals, and decision-making. Are they seeking a return to the status quo pre-coup, or are they looking to establish a reformed form of government in Myanmar?
Thank you very much. We have met a number of times with the National Unity Government in recent months, including at very senior levels of the State Department. I know that in the NSC as well, our Deputy Secretary, Wendy Sherman, has met with the NUG, and Councillor Derek Shirley has. And I think those meetings were very productive. We are able to learn that the NUG is very much, in favor of putting Burma back on the right path toward full democracy. And so those are areas that really do overlap with what we think should happen there. So, and not only the NUG, we would continue to consult with other parts of, civil society, those who are in support of rule of law, in support of democracy. And, I think that, in contrast to times past, this has really sobered the junta in the sense that what they thought was going to happen was that they would simply roll over these activists, those who favor democracy. That hasn't happened at all.
Proponents of opposition to the military regime have claimed repeatedly that their organization is inclusive of all ethnic groups and affiliations, including the Rohingya, who have been subjected to ethnic cleansing and potential genocide for years at the hands of the Myanmar military. Let me ask this question. I hope I have some time to do this. Administrator Hart, is it accurate to say that the Rohingya stand a better chance at receiving protection and inclusion with the opposition? If the opposition were to somehow take back control of the country, what would stop them from continuing to carry out violent and discriminative policies toward Rohingya?
And Mr. Hart, I'd have you keep your answer tight and short because time's expired.
Thank you so much for the question. While I think my colleague Kid Moy may have a more fulsome answer to this, I think that what we are interested in doing are assisting the people, the Rohingya and those who have been affected in Burma. And so that has been our perspective in terms of how can we best support them so that they can then achieve their goals. And that support right now is very basic in terms of the need to ensure basic humanitarian issues are being addressed, basic health issues are being addressed. That has been our focus that enables them to further support their own goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think I have any time to reel back, but thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Representative Kim. And for both you and Mr. Sherman raising the important issue that the national unity government has to be an inclusive government. I know in May, I think it was Representative Levin that raised that issue when we had a witness. We've also raised that issue directly with the national unity government if they want full recognition, full support. They're slowly moving in that direction, but they're not quite there, as Pete Asmoy has indicated, and we'll continue to deliver that message. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. Mr. Hart, you were talking about the mission of USAID is to help the people and to get assistance to the people. Has USAID explored, or is it now providing humanitarian assistance to locally administered territories outside the purview or control of the current military government?
Thank you, sir, for that question. Yes, we are providing a wide range of humanitarian assistance through the front door, if you will, into Burma, to be able to provide a range that I summarized earlier in terms of the basic needs. Because across the board, education systems have gone down, health systems have gone down, and we need better options. And so when we start...
So your answer is that outside of the control, territories that are outside the control of the current military junta, that are locally administered, often backed up by armed militias, we are in fact providing assistance to those territories directly.
So assistance is going through both our international and our local partners. They are adapting on a regular basis to be able to pursue exactly what you're speaking of, which is delivering these items to the most vulnerable. They are very innovative.
I'm sorry, because I'm worried about time, but thank you. Are you finding resistance from the military junta in your efforts to do that?
Absolutely. And that is why we are definitely relying on our implementing partners to be able to be as innovative as possible, given a conflict situation, to be able to identify who is out there that needs this assistance, how we can best get them to them. And we're working with other donor partners as well to be able to do just that. We are pursuing as many avenues as we can.
Got, and the Chinese are already doing that, are they not?
That is our understanding. What our coordination mechanism usually is through the UN to be able to coordinate with other donors, in addition to all of the other donor conversations that are going on. The USG has been definitely the lead in terms of humanitarian assistance, but we're also working with, as I mentioned earlier, the AHA Center out of ASEAN, the UN system as well, in terms of providing that response, and others to be able to coordinate the humanitarian assistance that is coming into country.
Thank you. Very heartening to hear. Mr. Moy, why did the U.S. government not declare genocide when the Tatmadaw was involved in numerous atrocities in trying to put down demonstrations opposing the military coup?
Mr. Congressman, not sure I can answer exactly. Sorry, I just unmuted myself. I'm not sure I can explain the reasons in the past. All I can say is that the review is ongoing today to make that determination. There, I think, are a number of steps that were taken in recent years to make it known that those atrocities were unacceptable. And, we will continue to condemn the regime because the current military was responsible for those, violations of human rights starting in 2017.
Well, let me just say as a member, and I'm sure other members feel the same way, the situation in Myanmar is grave. The violence and brutality exercised by the military junta is deplorable. And at some point, the United States government has to weigh in. We can't, for political niceties or in the hope that maybe we can create a diplomatic pipeline to the military by softening our position with respect to the atrocities that occurred. And I don't mean to say that we've soft-pedaled it, but at some point, it seems to me the heavy hammer here is to say these are genocidal, behaviors by the military junta, and we also need to be very cognizant of the message we're sending the Burmese people. They've got to be feeling very isolated right now. The United States is the essential player, even there, for them, and that means that we've got to weigh very carefully how we present this and how we condemn it. And so I strongly would urge you to go back to the State Department with your colleagues and let them know that there are many of us here in the Hill who believe the time has come for a much stronger statement than just condemning atrocities. I mean, of course we all condemn atrocities, but this pattern of atrocities means something. And what does it mean? And what is the United States prepared to say with respect to it? Thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Moy.
Thank you. And we do understand the importance and the urgency. Thank you.
I'm sure you do. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Connolly. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to follow up the sort of line of questioning related to sanctions. And certainly, along with the measures imposed last year, the administration's now sanctioned 65 individuals and sanctioned or placed export controls on 26 different organizations with close regime ties. So, Mr. Moy, I'd love to begin with you in your assessment. Could you, and I know that people have talked about sanctions along the way throughout this hearing, but can you give a baseline discussion of how effective these sanctions can be or have been, excuse me? In particular, what are the effects of sanctions on those who are aiding the Tatmadaw, but from within Burma, who don't necessarily have foreign assets?
Yeah, that's such a thoughtful observation right there, Madam Congresswoman. I think that the sanctions themselves were not intended to, in and of themselves, create the change, but are part of a larger policy to change the thinking of the regime. I think we all know that especially the junta leadership is not as exposed maybe as other entities in other countries would be to the international economy, and therefore sometimes sanctions, even in with a targeted approach, they might not be the dispositive, shall we say, element in the decision making.
And so, kind of given that, I think throughout the course of the hearing today, and even just drawing out from your answer to my first question, could you just talk about what other policy tools or points of leverage might be more impactful? Considerations about a ban on aviation fuel going into Burma or Myanmar, as an effort to stop deadly airstrikes. Are there other considerations or policy tools that have been considered and not implemented, or that you would want to raise in response to that question?
Yeah, there have been other tools that have been discussed, and in fact, as I noted earlier, we haven't actually rejected any of those as possible tools. We are trying to thread a needle, really, to make sure that we're causing no more harm out there to the people of Burma, but also delivering a message to the junta too. And so I think a few weeks ago, you might have seen we designated more, or we made a few more designations in terms of sanctions. We'll continue to review more possibilities, and that applies not just to those involved in or at more senior leadership positions, but also family members as well. You mentioned the entities. We are also in contact with other governments, those who might control financial purse strings, so to speak, that also might be able to apply a little bit more pressure.
So, Mr. Moy, just kind of related to that, because you mentioned some of our partner nations, knowing that the military does draw not an inconsequential amount of money from business interests and networks, in addition to state-owned conglomerates. What has the United States or any of our partners done to crack down on these other sources of revenue that come in for the military? And what, in your estimation, could be among the most effective ways for us to cut down on the junta's access to foreign currency?
Right. Yeah, without going into the specifics of the information, we have had conversations with a number of countries about the things they know and the actions they could take, because sometimes these economic or these transactions, if you will, are not made through the United States. And so when we do come across information, we can act on that information, and we've let other governments know that we will be coming to them. And I think that there is a willingness.
And coming to them with disapproval, am I understanding that correctly?
Right, coming to them with information that they can act, that's actionable, so to speak. And in our various conversations, especially when we've been on the road, I think that we have heard actually very positive reactions, because when it comes to other countries, they don't want their names sullied by dealing with the junta too. And so they have their own interest in working with us to make sure some of those sources of revenue are cut off.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Moy, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Spanberger.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You're the best. So I want to follow up on a couple of questions that I think Representative Sherman, Representative Kim asked, and broaden this out a little bit beyond the questions about the Rohingya, because in the November 2020 election, more than 1.5 million voters, or should be voters, were disenfranchised from mostly among ethnic minority communities in Kachin, Karen, Mon, Rakhine, Shan, and Chin states. And so and in our resolution after the coup, we called not just to restore the government, the sort of weird balance between the military and the civilian government that had existed, but true democracy and inclusive democracy. And what's interesting to me, Pete S. Moy, is that there have been, in the resistance and in the organizing of the people to, against the coup regime, there have been shoots, right, growing of collaboration. And I think of the majority Bamar people realizing that everyone's in this together and that they need to work together. So can you just say a little more about where does that stand today? Not just about the sort of opposition shadow government, but amongst what's happening in the country about people organizing so that the coup regime might be followed by a more fulsome democratic order.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for recognizing actually that there are changes that are underway. I do want to temper all this. I mean, you used the metaphor shoots, right? And I think that that's true. These are changes that will happen, gradually over time. But I think to the extent that we can help in that conversation, we have urged various groups, civil society groups, those are interested in, restoring democracy in Burma. We have had a constant conversation about, further recognition, and we see, as Congressman Sherman noted, a little bit of that coming through in where the NUG has invited representation from Rohingya, and the same is true for ethnic groups as well. They're finding common cause, and I guess that's sort of a good thing. But we still have a lot of real estate to cover when it comes to full recognition and these kinds of issues. I know my time is running short, but I did want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, Congressman. I do want to thank you actually for the work that you did, continuing to consult with the Fenster family. I know that Brian Fenster was in touch with you and other family members. We could not have, no one can do this alone. And when we saw Danny Fenster, when he came to the department shortly after his release, he was quite effusive in praise for all of those, people in Michigan who came to bat on his behalf. I just wanted to mention that.
Thanks. It was a whole of community effort, that's for sure. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And if I could just follow up on the point Mr. Levin made, it does seem like the Burma people, now that they're being attacked by the Tatmadaw, are realizing the atrocities that were perpetrated against the Rohingya. There's a long ways to go, but with the common enemy and recognizing they've all got to come together to fight for freedom, for those in the national unity government that are listening to this, that is a step in the right direction. And democracy is inclusive, and we'd like to continue to see that as you fight for your freedom. Let me recognize, Representative Kim, do you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask? Oops. Representative G, any additional questions? If not, let me recognize myself for an additional question. And maybe this is for Mr. Hart. One thing that, when I was in Thailand talking to the NGOs, and I think Deputy Secretary Sherman heard this as well, long history of refugee camps along the border. And this was in late October. Obviously, the violence has escalated, the targeted airstrikes, and the number of displaced individuals. Can you give us an assessment of what we're seeing in terms of the refugee camps, both internally displaced folks? Certainly we've read open source stories of refugees fleeing into India, as well as Cambodia and Thailand, and kind of your sense from the USAID perspective, or your implementing partners that are in the camp, how well equipped the camps are, if the border countries are allowing folks to flee across the border, or if they're being kept in camps internally within Burma.
Thank you for that question, sir. Yes, we have one of the benefits to having an office both in Thailand and in Burma, and we've opened our office almost 10 years ago in Burma, is being able to have that long-standing relationship with civil society, the civil society that will both be responding to and is responding to the humanitarian assistance crisis, but also that same civil society that will give voice to the democratic movement. And so we are working across the board with local entities to be able to respond to the range of issues that are coming up. To address your specific question, what we have, we also actually, Ken Moy and I, with the state councilor, traveled to Thailand as well to have those conversations. We are very much working together with our Thai counterparts, as well as with our ASEAN counterparts across the board, to be able to be creative when it comes to solution sets. We need that creativity now because the situation is very much fluid. On a week-to-week basis, things are changing based on the conflict. And so we need to be responsive and we need to be adapting to the situation. That's exactly the type of guidance that we have given our partners, is to be able to look for opportunities when they present themselves. There are definitely a sufficient number of roadblocks in our way, but we have partners and standing relationships to be able to understand how best we can get some of these items and services to a range of those being affected by this. When it comes to along the border areas, that's an area very much that we've been speaking with the Thais about as well, and have gotten their support as we look at the best way in which to address the very complex situation. And so we do have partners on both sides of the border.
Great, thank you. And let me now recognize Representative Spanberger if she has an additional question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So just to follow up a little bit related, well, on an issue separate from sanctions, the coup and certainly the ensuing conflict has resulted in a spike in the transnational drug trafficking challenges that we see globally, particularly from drugs emanating and originating in the Golden Triangle region of Burma. So I was wondering if you all could address some of the spillover effect, whether narcotics, crystal meth, meth pills, heroin, are destined for countries, including the United States, emanating out of this region, and what you're seeing in terms of what's the actual kind of current status, and then what is the U.S. response?
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. Our assessment is that it is one source of revenue for the junta, and that since the coup, there has actually been an increase in the amount of narcotics trafficking coming out of Burma. And so it is a difficult situation for us just because of the instability on the ground. We don't have our DEA colleagues with us today, But I would say that this is something that we have noted through our information channels, and we are going to have to take steps. But it is, an issue that is very difficult to resolve just because of what's happening on the ground.
And have we taken either kind of in a collaborative way, or have we discussed or raised this issue related to the increased flow of narcotics emanating from Burma? Has that been an issue that we've raised with some of our partners?
I think that our main thrust when we talk to our partners has been the path toward or the return to the path toward democracy for Burma. I think probably increasingly, depending on the partner, because there are a number of border countries that are very concerned about that illegal trade and what it might mean to their own stability and their own economies. I think that it may actually become more of a conversation piece down the road. In the past, there has definitely been concern on the Chinese side of the border about the opium trade, and I don't think that they are interested in seeing an increase in the amount of drugs or narcotics going into the PRC. And I think that there are other sort of neighboring countries as well that are concerned about that. But again, the situation is unstable as it is, and the trajectory of Burma right now, and I didn't want to return to the terminology failed state, but if that's where we're headed, there are so many problems that we're dealing with, and narcotics would be absolutely one of those.
Well, certainly in my life before Congress, when I was over at CIA, I spent some time working in what was then called the Counter Narcotics Center, and certainly have seen firsthand how an uncontrolled and unbridled or a profitable narcotics trafficking enterprise can really just cut efforts to democratize or strengthen democracies off at the knees. So I thank you for your answers, and I do hope that moving forward, central to our efforts to advocate for democratic values, that we'll look at some of the illicit activities that are certainly contributing to the proliferation of criminal activity and a move away from democracy. So thank you very much to both of our witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Spamberger. Let me now recognize Representative Jen Kim if you've got any additional questions.
Thank you so much, and I do apologize for my technical difficulty here with my computer this morning. Secretary Moy, since the coup, Radio Free Asia and Voice of America both have experienced a dramatic spike in audience via Facebook and online, with millions turning to these news sources as the junta mercilessly cracks down on local outlets and journalists. But with more Burmese people fleeing unrest, heading to border provinces and zones, where there is less cell signal available, people are turning to radio, particularly shortwaves, to get potentially life-saving news and information. So is the administration, including the state, USAID, and the USAGM, aware of that? And how are they coordinating efforts to ensure that the shortwave is sustained for the people of Burma who rely on outside media, but especially RFA and the extensive coverage of what is happening?
Well, thank you very much. And it is actually a very good observation about what is happening on the ground. And so one of the things that we are aware of is the huge crackdown on domestic journalists there. I think that is why they're turning to, as you mentioned, shortwave sources. We have mentioned how deeply concerned we are, and we've actually been, in our conversations with like-minded partners, we're in unison in condemning any actions against journalists, and we've called for the release of those they've detained, and they have detained many. And so I think when I was speaking to Congressman Levin's interest in Danny Fenster, I mean, this is one of the great concerns that the Tatmadaw has, right? That there are journalists that are reporting all of this information, and you have so much more social media out there. And this is another a data point, is that there are so many people in Burma on Facebook, on other social media platforms, and they're exchanging information. This is what makes it so hard for the junta to consolidate. So I think that we'll continue to push. There isn't a free and independent media right now, just because of the crackdown. But we are definitely in support. We are definitely in support of other platforms that might be used, and so people can get accurate information out there. And we have heard from people on the ground that this is absolutely a source, and why they are so that sometimes it energizes them when they hear about actions that are taken outside. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any information sources, right? So when they learn about some of the things that other countries are doing, or the human rights organizations, what they're doing out there, it gives them hope, it gives them energy to continue to resist the junta.
Madam Congresswoman, if I may, just to add on to that answer that Ken has provided, I think one of the things that's been very critical is, and I have to laud the efforts of our partners, immediately following the coup, supporting each other, including independent media, in very pragmatic, practical ways. And so I think that has been an excellent first step. What we have done about 4 months ago is launched an additional activity to be able to support human rights and looking at supporting independent media and other civil society entities. And I think with that activity, while I can't say too much, I would say that one of the principles is to ensure that we are doing no harm, because those who are engaged in this are very much under threat. And so we are establishing communication channels. We are making sure that the right people are engaged in those efforts and looking to push forward with this extremely critical aspect of achieving what the people want to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both of our witnesses today. And thank you, Chairman. I hear that.
Great. Thank you, Representative Kim. Let me make a closing statement. First off, to both our witnesses, Mr. Moy, Mr. Hart, thank you for your service and the teams that are around you. Also, just want to once again thank Ambassador Vida and our Mission Rangoon team that is operating in difficult circumstances, but continues to support the work. And I'll also just want to deliver a message to the people of Burma. The United States is the world's oldest democracy, and one of the values that we uphold is the rights of individual people to choose their path forward. And as we see this young democracy in Burma and the people standing up for their right to choose their own path forward, I can't speak for everyone in Congress, but I think it's a sentiment, Democrats, Republicans, the administration, and the values of the people of the United States, is that we stand with you, that we stand and want to see the people of Burma in an inclusive way, understanding the diversity and the various ethnic groups, find their path forward. And we know, as was the birth of our nation in the United States, it was difficult and at times violent, but the perseverance, the will of the people will prevail. And to the democracies of the world, we will continue to stand with the people. We'll continue to work with the leaders in ASEAN, understanding ASEAN centrality and that Burma is one of the ASEAN partner countries, and support those ASEAN efforts to find a diplomatic path forward if there is one, but also continue to work with the countries in the region to provide their support as they address some of the humanitarian issues of the people of Burma. So again, with that, I want to thank the witnesses and the members who participated in this important virtual hearing. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. Virtual bang of the gavel.